we'll figure out something amusing to fit into this. But yeah, I'm trying to think what else has been going on. Like, what has been fun miniatures wise that I've seen. So, Old Umbre for Warmachine is on my must-have list right now because it's just pure folk horror with the beasties in there, and it's just like a lot of fun with how they've done the designs. I think we're getting to see some, like, I think Steamforge is really moving into like their new kind of like phase with Warmachine to get those designs done, because like the Gravediggers I showed to my opponent on yesterday where we were playing a game after the game, and they're such good diesel punk miniatures, and then with Old Umbre being this like folk horror, that's got me quite excited. And as a result, I've not touched any of my Trench Crusade that I've still got to paint.
It's funny that just as you mentioned Old Umbre, the storm here at my end just really kicked off, and lightning crackling through the sky, which was a little bit ominous. Yeah, I'm quite interested with the new Warmachine. As I said to you before, I haven't played Warmachine really since Horde, since the first edition. I've got some of the miniatures for them still, but I didn't touch it for a long time. And then seeing it, coming back again now, and obviously it's gone through a lot of changes. I know setting-wise they had the sort of basically the kind of apocalypse kickoff with the Requiem stuff. Obviously we played the IK RPG together with the adventure arc, which was set obviously pre all that in comfortable ground for me. But I'm quite interested looking at some of the new changes. I'm really only starting to look at it now, so I don't have any particularly in-depth knowledge of how it's looking at this stage.
Well, you're in a good position, because here's the fun thing. I keep saying this to many people who are like considering coming back to it. The rules are fundamentally the same. So if you're coming at it from having only from a good recollection, a semi-okay recollection of like first edition, right? Then it's basically the same game. The only things that have changed is you don't have all the leadership nonsense. Like you don't have fear, you don't have rallying and all that stuff, and you don't have to dish out orders from your warcaster. Models don't have facings anymore, meaning you don't get free strikes and stuff if they move out of your 90-degree side. That's just so like too much. And you don't have templates for weapons anymore, so it's more like 40k. I say a bit more like 40k. It's actually not really in some respects, but you don't have templates. It's a bit easier than that. And again, I think that's just to remove the kind of like the edge cases of like scatters and stuff.
But my beloved bile thrall sprays are gone.
Right. And it speeds up gameplay. And then the other thing is units. Now I think because you're coming out from first edition, units never really got that big anyway. They were like about 5 or 6 models, and that was it. Maybe if they had an attachment.
Got to 10. There were 10-man squads for some of them.
Okay.
And then you could have an attachment on top, so you could have like 12 models maybe.
So
but obviously most didn't have attachments.
Yeah, so units now are pretty much capped at around about 5 models or less. So what you don't get is the classic Khador Death Star of Winter Corps troops moving forward with Kovnik Joe being unstoppable and tar-pitting your warjacks. That can't happen anymore. So units are... So they've got the balance, I feel, where units are useful, but they don't outshine the warjacks and the warbeasts. And that's basically... Oh, and then the way units move is different. So it's like Star Wars Legion. You move a model, and then you redeploy the rest nearby.
Right, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the change in unit size thing is probably good from the perspective of someone who's looking to get back into some more games, spread my play experiences a bit, because it's less buy-in necessary when you're having to buy and paint a 10-man squad than a 5-man, for example. Not because you might necessarily not having to paint, say, different number of models in the army overall, but because a variety is the spice of life, and there's a certain if your army list is going to be like, and 10 of these guys and another 10 of these guys, there comes a point where you're getting a bit bored basically rather than if you have a bit small units, discrete things can be broken up into hobby projects more easily, and maybe have more variety within a list.
So in my Gravediggers army, I've got my Warcaster. There are 3 Warjacks and 2 more Warjacks that get aerial dropped into the game.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is a machine gunner crew and a solo. There might be another solo in there, then maybe. And then the rest of the models in the army are a 5-man squad of trenchers, another 5-man squad of trenchers, a 3-man squad of character commando trenchers, and a 3-man squad of gun majors. So basically, if you're playing a full 100-point games of Warmachine, you're actually only ever using you've only got maybe 20 single trooper models to paint. The rest is all big chunky stuff. So, and of course, if you build your army in particular ways, you might just have more Warjacks and just be like, or even huger ones, an 80mm or 100, or you've got Colossal or something. So depending on what you really want to get out of it and whether you're a lazy painter or not, you can just go, I don't want to have many troops to paint. I'm going to play this way just because it's more fun. So yeah, it's been quite refreshing that way. So yeah, definitely if you get a chance to look at it, that'll be cool. What was the last war game you played anyway, Chris?
So, that's a good question. I mean, I think the last war game I actually played, I'm trying to think if I picked up anything different. It probably is going to be Age of Sigmar.
Yeah.
Playing with a friend of mine, testing out the Skaven list I was sort of building for the first year of the current edition. The new General's Handbook has come out now and changed quite a lot of what's good and what's not necessarily in a bad way. I think it's mixed up, changed things up quite nicely, but it's also changed a bit about what I now might want to get for the army.
Yeah. So
it would be Age of Sigmar. I haven't played that many games in the new edition yet, just due to lack of chance, moving over here, etc. But that was quite fun. I've had some quite fun games, some quite tight games. I played some 40k, but I said before, I found it quite stressful actually, because it's quite this could be quite intense with the lines of fire cover and the high damage output of a lot of units. So you slip up and put things in the wrong place and things die very quickly. So I'm enjoying Age of Sigmar. It felt a lot more laid back actually in the gameplay experience. It felt a lot more chilled out. Not that there's no tension to it whatsoever, but and certainly not. I'm not saying like a beer and pretzels level of kind of chilled out, but just more enjoyable, I think, from that level of decision making moment to moment. It was all a bit less intense. 40k, you've got a lot of stratagems. You're thinking about what your opponent's stratagems are. You're thinking about where you're very careful placements and distances. Whereas Age of Sigmar, the push and pull with things like the commands in that suggest themselves a bit more naturally because everyone's sharing the same ones, and a lot of them are now do something in your opponent's turn. So I found it to flow more easily without having to be constantly
It's interesting you say that because that's something my friend Mark, who I need to do a podcast with him. I need to arrange to do a podcast with him soon actually, because he's got something to rant about. Yeah, right. Who hasn't got something to rant about? Games Workshop anyway. But he was saying how 40, how you said with 40k you had to think about your stratagems, and then you also had to keep in mind your opponent's stratagems.
Yes.
And it's I think this is where the what we basically call is cognitive load, right, of a game.
Yes.
And why, if we think about why, and I've tried to show my wife how, we should try playing the Vampire the Masquerade Rivals, the limited card game, because it's basically Eternal Struggle, but non-collectible, right? But why did she not like that? And I think this is a problem with 40k's gone into, is you have to know not just your army's stratagems, you need to know your opponent's stratagems. And so
and those can vary detachment to detachment. There can be quite a few of them.
So knowing the game is not just what's in front of you with your book, it's their book as well. And again, I find this interesting compared to Warmachine, where I don't feel as compelled to know inside out the opponent's army, and how because the rules are free on the app, so I've mostly already read them to a certain extent anyway, but also because if they say, oh, this thing's got stealth and it's got this spell which does causes concealment, it's like, I know what that does because everything's written in a universal nomenclature, which 40k doesn't. And the only game that I feel like that does weirdness like that is Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, I think you're right about cognitive load, and obviously, to be clear, I mean, some people love that. Some people they are, that is where their fun with 40k is, and it's it's a big fun toolbox. For me, I was playing in a little tournament basically, and I made myself a cheat sheet with just my stratagem. So I go, right, it's this phase. I have to remember that if I'm going to use this stratagem,
was there a flow chart?
Yeah, basically, and that kind of is the case with Age of Sigmar, but they kind of make it for you. They say, like, here's a list of all these things, and because again, it's the same for everybody. You do need to know your opponent's army, but let's say I'm facing Nighthaunt, the ethereal spectres. The things I need to know are, okay, well, Nighthaunt are these weird ethereal flying ghost guys, so they can easily move around. They've got the unmodifiable save, and then the specifics of the enemy army is he'll have one trick that's not related to you. He'll have his battle formation, and that will be one thing, and that could be really impactful. But it's one thing. So, he's got the battle formation that's all about the black coaches that makes them really cool. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Now I know the totality. If I know that, I know the totality of the tricks. I don't need to know that there's a whole different set of enhancements and stratagems, etc., just for that one thing. And building the list is equally easier. And again, I'm not ragging on people who really do enjoy that aspect of 40k and other games. But I did find, maybe I'm just getting old, but there is a cognitive load is certainly a thing, especially because, and this is very much a context thing. I don't know about how it was for you, but for me, back in the day when I used to play various other war games, a lot of it was very much like chilled out. Hey, let's get together, let's play this game over an afternoon, no pressure, and so you're not super worried about how long it takes you to do stuff. But not just 40k, but a lot of games now I feel have become quite structured, so that they can be played at, people want to do tournaments, they want to do competitive play, they want to do all these kind of things, and that does mean that there is, I feel like maybe culturally we've got more of a thing of like, it's expected you'll come and you'll play a game in a limited amount of time, whether out of respect and not wasting the other person's time, or because there's more games that need to be done, or there simply isn't time for it. And so I've felt now with something like 40k a lot more time pressure, sometimes, about getting through things at a reasonable rate of speed, and that aggravates all the cognitive load of all the things you need to know. Whereas with Age of Sigmar, because there's much less of that, I feel like I can get through a game much more calmly, speed-wise.
It's giving me some confidence. I need to look at Age of Sigmar again, actually. That's interesting.
Yeah,
and
it's not for everybody.
I did like some of how they rewrote Age of Sigmar, where everything is an ability. Like, deployment is actually an ability, because things will get deployed mid-game.
Yeah.
And that I thought was that was a very insightful way of changing how to present rules.
I don't think they've always taken it as far as they could, and maybe should, but they certainly used it to do some interesting things. And there's stuff that refers to abilities. And generally, it's tripped quite a few people up, at least early on in the edition, I think. I see a lot of people going, but how does this work with this? And people go, it's just an ability. It just does what it says. It literally is that, is this thing the fight ability? No, the fight ability tells you what it does. It's just an ability. It works like that. And so you had a lot of people, because they were coming from a different paradigm, I suppose, it was quite confusing for them. Like, everything is an ability suddenly, rather than this. What you get in most war games is this shift between this kind of assumed shift that's often not very well spelled out between the core spine of rules, who are just rules who aren't really broken down in that way, and then abilities on things, and then that in between level of interactions, where, because it's never discreetly turned into these sort of chunks, people just assume, well, it's obvious, this is how it works, and then ironically that does trip people up when they move from something like that with a lot of non-stated but understood elements to something that just states it quite discreetly. Like, I don't know if you played Warhammer role-playing games wise, have you ever played 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons? Because that did something a bit similar with its powers.
I've never touched it, but like Mike says very good things about it because it is incredibly well structured.
Yes, and whatever else you might say, I really enjoyed 4th edition, but it did have a thing where the combat was very good. But if you made the combat good, it also took a long time. But it did have a thing where structure-wise, it did that much more. The structure was very good, but it threw a lot of people off because they weren't used to that. Now, Age of Sigmar doesn't have 4th Edindi's issues in that respect, but I feel like maybe there's a similar kind of thing of people approaching the game going, well, how do we kind of build the machinery of the game in a specific way that I think they've done probably quite well in Age of Sigmar. Because, like I said, a lot of games people don't think about that sort of thing. They just sort of bang it together and then off out the door. And the sliding scale between where in the rule set a given rule sits is never really examined.
Because it's like with like movement, and then a spell that causes movement. It's all movement.
Yes.
It's the question is, how is it triggered? Is it triggered as part of your turn sequence? Is it part of your turn as a result of some spell or ability? Or is it movement triggered as a result of an interaction with what your opponent's doing? But it's all movement.
And one of the things that keys off that, I've seen as a failure point in a few games over the decades, I can't remember specific examples off the top of my head, but I've seen it, is that where people will go, well, this power is very powerful, so I'm going to make sure you can't use it with the extra movement by using this core thing you get for extra movement to really like keep a crimp on this power. And then an ability or capability or some rule comes in later that gives a unit movement that isn't that specific thing, so it isn't covered by the rule that stops that interaction from happening. And the next thing you know, people are going, well, you can just combine these two and win the game really quickly, or whatever the specific failure point is. That's quite common. It's a repeated error you see over the decades in various different war games when people haven't thought about
that. And at this point on the cold opening, we now actually will start talking about what we're going to talk about eventually. So hi, I'm Chris. Welcome to Realm of Fire. I'm joined by Chris Allen, who is a freelance writer, game designer for RPGs. He writes for Black Library. Yet we spent the first 15 minutes talking about game mechanics. That's the least interesting bit of world building going on, I think. But no, actually, I think it's because we both hit the same issue, which is, I'm sure this turns up as part of like your writing for Black Library, and it turns up for me as part of writing for the RPGs. It's like you're looking at a codex, or you're looking at an army book. You go like, "This is the rules for this model." And you're like, "And I'm meant to turn this into like world building, role playing material, and I need to make this character or this antagonist or something seem like in the narrative they're capable of doing something that is vaguely reminiscent of what that rule is inferring they can do."
Yes.
Which always is a fun moment.
Yes. And you get it. I mean, you get it even in just role-playing games with existing material where there's a setting. In the setting, there's a character established and they've got some ability. And of course, players will go, well, how do I do that? And then you're going, well, actually, I don't know. And sometimes you get mismatches between writing and mechanics from the core, and then you've got a kind of like, to grab an example, Trinity Continuum Eon. I was given a job basically rewriting one of the psi orders from that game, the big, powerful, the heroic, sometimes anti-hero, but heroic, the groups that you expect in player characters to come from. And I was rewriting the Ministry, who are the telepaths. And basically there was an issue with one way they'd been portrayed in previous material, with how they were basically very internally a bit paranoid, and because of course any one of your comrades could be using telepathy on you to like change your memories and you wouldn't know. But of course the mechanics of how that psychic power worked in the game didn't match that. You couldn't just permanently change people's memories trivially in that way. Yeah. So when I was examining like the world building aspect of rebuilding that culture, how it was presented in Prometheus Unbound in the expansion, I remember going back and reading through the past game, right, what can these people actually do in the game mechanics, and then trying to bring that forward into the new material that we were writing, because you do get that disconnect. between material, whether it's like you say from a license, from a game, from a story, from within the game itself. You get these disconnects that can be quite jarring. However, I will say sometimes I cheat the other way. And I wrote a novella for Trinity Continuum, and in it a character has basically personal regeneration powers, among other things like life powers. And I cheated slightly. I think I may have done something with her that technically isn't something you can do directly in the rules. It's something you can infer from the rules. It's pretty possible. But I did it anyway because it made a good story. You know?
Yeah. I guess that's the rub, is like, you know, with actually just writing pure fiction, you obviously with what is allowed by the line developer, obviously for it, which obviously I'm sure with Trinity you have had more freedom than you do with a Warhammer associated, but is you do what's good for the story to progress it, rather than thinking about are you abiding by the rules in that respect.
Yeah,
and
it's. I mean, there was a certain amount of in that novella. There's a certain amount of stuff where how some of the psionics works is quite relevant, but I was certainly going for a rule of cool in places where rather than getting down to what I don't like to do generally is I don't like to do a thing where in the text for fiction it's literally saying, and then they did this thing, which is basically, and you can say like they're literally using this ability from this card as if it was the game.
Yeah.
You know, when I talked about, say, shape-shifting for the Forsaken short story, I didn't say that. And now he shifted to this specific form. I just talked about the fluidity of the shifting experience for the character and how that affected, like, with the instincts and the. You want that kind of blurring in fiction, because if it becomes too granular in terms of translating game stuff across, you feel like you are reading a game unfolding, not a story.
Yeah. I mean, this is my thing always, which I think was reinforced into me from Vampire the Requiem, and I carried it over to whenever I ran Masquerade for 5th edition and talked to anybody about it, is that the likelihood of vampires referring to disciplines by name, by the game name, is minuscule, because they likely don't think of it that way. They just, like, either because it's a type of power which is innate and second nature, and once you've taught the person how to kind of like also do the fundamentals of that. So, you know, you could talk about, like, I guess, celerity, moving quickly, or potence. Then you don't really need to tell them, like, now I'm going to tell you how to do Fist of Iron. It's like, no, now we're going to show you how. You basically go, right, think about what you've done, think on that hard, and, like, just keep practicing, because you'll eventually work out how to do it, but you'll be able to punch through brick walls, right? And they'll be like, oh yeah, cool. And then, like, with other stuff, I think the only place where there's mostly, like, fixed names for, like, power manifestation is likely things like the Tremere, because obviously they are meant to be spells.
Yes.
And they come from the fact when they were actually mortal wizards, so that makes sense. So, and I think similarly, there's mostly stuff somewhere that I haven't actually ever thought about in Warhammer fiction, mainly 40k, because that's what I've written the most of for Wrath and Glory, that there are things which again has game terms in the war game that we've translated to being something in the RPG, but actually would never be spoken of in such a transparent, obvious way, because it's just it just is something they do. It's not this named thing that they go through effort to do. So it's and that, I think, is actually a really interesting point, though, for, like, if you are running RPGs based upon these games that are based upon the war games, is again to think about that jargon, because that might help your players feel less stilted in how they're representing, like, I don't know, an inquisitorial interrogator or a tech marine or some such. Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, that I guess, yeah, you say that comes a lot from writing novellas and novels set in these worlds. What other kind of like, I know obviously we're restricted by so many NDAs on these things. What other kind of like, but I mean, we can talk in broad strokes, because I think we're definitely talking in world building sets. Like, what other kind of challenges do you hit with the world building, where you're kind of like trying to meet the expectation of like, this should feel like what fans of the IP have interacted with?
Yes.
Because the classic one I always come back to, and I said this on the painting phase, is where there is the game fiction, but the game fiction, well, no, there are the game rules, but the game rules ultimately serve to make it a fun game experience.
Yeah.
Space Marines will very unlikely get harmed by a las gun. So then we go to like looking at, say, you look at the Eisenhorn trilogy, Space Marines are terrifying in it. Chaos Space Marines more so. And then you look at the RPG and you're kind of like, well, we can't have them godlike, but they need to feel powerful versus, say, if you've got that mixed party where there is a commissar. The commissar should feel capable next to their Marine friend, yet clearly there needs to be a distinction that the Marine is going to do bloody murder in combat versus the commissar who will happily gun down some Chaos cultists, but shit a brick when it's like Chaos Space Marines. So I guess like for fiction writing, there must be some of those things where that needs to feel different to the game.
Yeah, there's obviously, with a big license, there's always going to be stuff that's set in stone, because that's just sort of how it needs to be for the games to function. If you're writing for Warhammer 40,000, I imagine you're never going to get authorized to write a story where everyone has a lovely, happy, peaceful time and the seeds of peace blossom for the beginning of harmony across the thing. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, there needs to be a war game with people fighting one another. I think, but moving from that extreme to more reasonable examples, I think there's two things. Right, the first is just coming into it with a reasonable mindset. You're playing in someone else's sandpit, and the rule, and to me at least, the rules of that are generally fairly obvious of the do's and don'ts with regards to the limitations. I'm not chafing up. I don't find much in the way of limitations to chafe against there, because most of it is common sense stuff. But there's certainly elements where you've got various sort of pulls on you as a writer, because obviously you want to write a good story, but you also want to write something that appeals to fans of, say, the factions that you are writing about. And there's some deep running kind of resentments maybe over playing, but there's certain complaints about like, whenever my faction turns up in a book, it's so that they can get the crap kicked out of them, or they're never the protagonists. These guys are the protagonists. It's never these guys. You don't see a book from their point of view.
Certainly players never complain about this. They never make those complaints. Well, they know they're their antagonists all the time.
You know what you've signed up for if you're a fan. Yeah. But there's that element of like, so the fans want to see stuff that's going to make them feel that enjoyment, because that's their faction. And for all it's derided as bolter porn, some people want that kind of that action, that direct visceral action element. Some people want different kinds of stories set in that setting. You can't please everybody, obviously. But I think there's this thing of like, when it comes to translating, say, the game stuff into it, or going back and forth with the game, for me, I think the happy medium sits around, as we said before, writing stuff from in a manner that makes sense for the characters in the story. So in like term use, if you pick up some random Free Guild Steelhelm in the Age of Sigmar, he's not going to be looking at the Stormcast tromping past. He's not going, and there are the Liberators with their Thunderstrike hammers, and those guys are clearly Reclusians. He's going to be going, they're a bunch of golden-clad demigods, 8 feet tall. I'm not too fussed about the specifics of what kind of weapon they're waving, But in the descriptions you use, you can obviously bring forth a lot of the rich detail about the Stormcast units in a way that makes sense within the story of what's happening, who's been sent there, why they're using the tools of what they're using, in a way that's recognizable to fans, so they can go, do that. That's a Liberator, But Johnny Hammerhal doesn't necessarily know that. and you're concerned maybe about his ground level view of if you're writing from his view, you're concerned about that. And so I think there's a lot of fun that can be had by that angle of it, by just saying like, yeah, we're not going to be using all these game terms in here because the people involved don't know. And then when it does come up, then it can provide a more, say using the Stormcast unit names, for example, it actually provides a more interesting contrast when you then have a scene with a Stormcast officer trying to figure out what the hell he's going to do with his troops. And he is referring to some of these units by what they are, because of course he does know, and that does concern him. And it's not there just because you're going, oh, look at me, I've put Liberators in. It's because he's thinking, these are the troops I have available to achieve my goals. And it is relevant what their training and speciality is to me here. If every time anything turns up, it's a capital letter, noun unit, for me, I find that gets a bit stilted. Now, for some people really like it. For me, it gets a bit. But if you have that more natural kind of, I guess, interplay, where it's coming up in the minds, mouths, and scenes of people who know or care, then you get that more natural kind of gradient flow, I guess, from one end of the guy who just doesn't know what's going on, and all the way to the guy who knows exactly what's going on, and you can have that contrast.
I think that approach is really important for is good for GMs of if you're playing Age of Sigmar Soulbound, again, if you're not going to know everything about the other factions that other players are playing characters from. So just because you've got a Daughter of Cain in the party doesn't mean you should explain noun this is doing adjective this with power X.
No.
You can say that outside of the we've got to resolve some combat now. They're hitting you with, the Medusalai's icy stare thing or whatever the hell it's got. I can't remember. And I think even more so, the game where this is definitely true of being more, I guess, so you're not collecting Pokemons with in-game terms is Imperium Maledictum, because the odds are you're playing some poor human he's been hired by an Inquisitor. Jack shit of what's going on. You'll know what an orc is. Most probably you've heard of them, but you won't know the nuances between the orc clans, orc technologies, all of that. You won't know that that's a shock attack gun that's being fired or anything like that. Assuming you ever come up against orcs, and assuming you ever see a Space Marine, because of course we get such a, for 40k at least, I don't know how much of this is true for Age of Sigmar, it's mostly also quite similar. In 40k, the odds of a human, your common human, ever seeing a Space Marine is vanishingly small.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the equivalent in Age of Sigmar is. I feel Stormcast are a bit more present in the world than Marines.
They're interesting because in a way, I mean, fundamentally they're more mythic than Marines. Marines are obviously portrayed in mythic terms as Angels of the Empire, but the Stormcast are literally lightning demigods. But at the same time, the way they presented the setting, most of the cities of Sigmar, the megalopolises, the super cities, and some of the smaller ones that are being set as well, have a Stormcast garrison. They have a keep in there, Stormkeep, that will have, might be a tiny number, they will have some there, and you might never see them as the guy on the street. You might never, or very rarely, if ever, see them, but you will know that it is this group of Stormcast in that keep watching over you. There is at least a symbol of their presence that's quite present, if you like, which isn't, say, in 40k is a bit different with Space Marines, because there can be hive worlds of billions of people that will never ever see a Space Marine except in a stained glass window in the cathedral. And obviously Necromunda has Space Marine links to it, like some Space Marines that improve us to recruit there. But obviously in Necromunda, until very recently, has not been a game in which Space Marines ever turned up. I believe there is now totally not a Space Marine as a bounty hunter type character, the guy without his armor, some sort of renegade.
I've not looked at his rules deep enough, and I know the lore. I need to look at the miniature. It might be a fun one to get hold of. But yes. Cool. So yeah, so you've been collecting and playing recently. You've done some Age of Sigmar with your Skaven.
Yes,
What?
I got
Yeah, what fun are you having with the Skaven?
quite a lot because when I first started playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which was 4th edition, I first army for Warhammer I ever collected was Skaven. And when I say collected, I mean, I was a kid. I got some stuff and I never really painted all of it, and I never had a painted army. So when I'd gotten back in, I started on Age of Sigmar tail end of 2nd edition because some friends were playing it. And 3rd edition I played it a bit and I got some Cruel Boys, but I hadn't really sat down and gone I had some Siege, quite a lot of Siege. But I'd done the thing where I'd bought a bunch of it and I was using it to play games, but it was mostly unpainted plastic. And I was getting back into painting, hadn't really hit my stride, fiddling around with, I chose some color scheme stuff that maybe was going to be a bit of a pain to see through for the army. So I'd sort of fallen off it a bit in terms of hobby progress. So with the Skaven, I thought, well, this would be a great time to get back into Skaven, my first army, because they're doing the big re-release. They're doing new versions of lots of units. But I absolutely cannot have more unpainted plastic piling up here. And I've got to paint it. I've got to figure out a way to do this that involves me having a painted army. And this was particularly stirred off. I was playing 40k actually at the time with a friend who he had both the armies we were playing with, and it just happened that I played with his Space Marines that he fully painted. And this was the first time I played with like a fully painted army of anything in a very long time. And I just really enjoyed it. Something about it just really lifted the experience. And I thought, I've got to do this. I've got to have this for myself. If I start from base principles, the armies I've accrued from stuff from, they've got a lot of inertia, they're not going anywhere. If I say I'm getting Skaventide, and I'm going to paint all the Skaven and Skaventide, and then I'm going to buy the next Skaven thing, and I'm going to paint that, and then buy the next Skaven thing, and paint that, constantly buying much more manageable chunks, rather than just letting myself go, oh, I'll definitely paint this, I'll buy all these things. And that has actually worked really well. I now have. Tomorrow, actually, I'm going to be playing 2,000 points of Skaven with the new General's Handbook. So I'm ready, got them all boxed up in my carry case. And so on the one hand, I've been enjoying playing, but I've actually been really enjoying the hobby side of it for the first time in a long time. Because in the 40k side, I've been collecting Chaos Space Marines. And again, I chose a color scheme that's fun. But Chaos Space Marines are a sod to paint with for my skill level of painting with all the trim. Yeah. And then I chose a difficult color scheme, and it was very tiring. So when I started on the Skaven, I thought, I've got to find a way I can do this that's not like this. That's going to work. I thought, well, firstly, contrast paints now exist, right?
Yeah, it's a huge game changer for Skaven, definitely.
I thought, and then I'm going to do this systematically. And I was pootling around the internet, and I came across a content creator, painter called Warhipster, and his whole thing is he uses contrast paint as the base, and then he does the other stuff on top. And I thought, this is great. Maybe this is how I can do this. And my painting is nowhere near as good as his, and still isn't, even after painting with Skaven. I'm not a very good painter, but if I don't make sure I have a quick way to do it, I will take forever doing mediocre painting. So I thought, if I can make my mediocre painting faster, this could work.
Well, this is the trick, because it allows you, because I think this thing with contrast paints, and I think you can get into a mindset with quite happily with army painting, and it's so much easier now than back when I had to do army painting in the Ultranum store, and geez, I never wanted to paint another Rider or Rohan, but you can paint everything with contrast, especially, it doesn't have to just be, it's not limited to contrast paints, but I think the point is you can paint everything to a fairly, quite actually now rapidly, so it looks actually quite decent, especially if you're doing some slap chop as well. And then you can go, right, everything's done to that level, and then go back and go, right, I'm going to do some extra bits of highlights on this unit. Then I'll do the same now on that unit. And you can break up into so many little manageable chunks, because the contrast paints and slap chop, if you're using that for your zenithal highlight priming, has done so much work for you already that when it's on the table 2 foot, about a foot away, it's all visually appealing anyway. So who the hell gives a damn?
Absolutely. I mean, it's worked. And now I have 2,000. I have a bit more because I've got other stuff. Some of it's painted, some of it's not bringing. I've got over 2,000 points of Skaven painted, and I can now put a whole army painted on a table, and that's so
That's
that
cool.
theoretically that's taken me a year, but in practice I haven't been painting for about 6 months of that year. So I'm really happy with the progress I've made on the hobbying side, and ironically, it's made me. So I got the warp spark weapon batteries, which is the rattling guns, warp fire throwers, scourges. And I thought, I don't really want to have to buy multiples of these, but what if I do something I've never done before and magnetize them? And because I was much happier with because I had this momentum behind me, I thought, I will try it. I've never done this before. I'll try it, and I have now successfully magnetized a set of rattling guns.
Cool.
Something that when I started this, I would have been like, no way am I trying that. That's advanced stuff, and B, God, what a nightmare. But it was actually relatively painless to do.
That's good.
Yeah, so the whole hobby side of it's really helped by coming at it with a plan that I've been able to see through. It's been really helpful. The game has been pretty good. I've enjoyed it a lot. I'm liking where it's going with some of the changes in the new Joe's handbook. It's been an odd year for releases. There's been a bit of a lull between a lot of stuff early in the year and then a big lull. But today they've shown off the new Caradron, which looks pretty good. So I'm hoping there'll be a bit of an uptick again in releases there to get that hype and energy in the community up. But from my point of view, that's been pretty good. It's been like the realization of a long-running thing of just being. I think a lot of people in war games a lot of people do paint whole armies really well, fantastically. But I think a lot of us are that grade of painter where we're not that great, and it takes us a while. And it's always more tempting to buy something and build it than it is to paint it. You're more tempted to play with it, and to finally get to that stage where I can turn and go, well, not that they're here right now because they're all in my carry case, but to go, oh, right behind me, here's this army I've painted. Are they all amazing? They painted. Will they really? They're not going to win any competitions, but it's there. It's done. It's like, and you can build on that once you've done it. It's easier to progress once you've done the core.
It's surprising how much really people on the internet are just wowed by what would be called, tabletop standard paint job, and that isn't actually that much. It's literally like contrast, metal, a bit, maybe a wash here and there, and perhaps a dry brush here or there. It's it's such a good thing. Like, I think, and what you said, like it's great to have a whole army painted. I mean, that's where for me it's been like because I realized it's about a year since I got my initial Signar and Khador painted up.
Yeah,
because I got them from Privateer Press. I ordered them from Privateer Press, and I had them and didn't touch them because they were released after Gen Con 2023. And now I'm at the point where I've got, a whole Signar Storm Legion. I say whole, it's an army. It can have more stuff added to it, of course. I've got a whole army of Gravediggers, which is also Signar, and there's bits in those two armies that can be mixed and matched, like Kane and his command cadre. And then I've got the Khador army, which is also 100 points worth. And then I've got like the Hordes one, the starters, the Brine Bloods and the Chimera. And then I've got my Crix army, which is 100 points of fun with the Cephalax. And the point is that the interesting thing about why I think where that's been interesting and fun is because you can quite happily play a 30-point game or a 50-point game or a 75 or 100, and you get the full experience of the game no matter what size you play, because you have that the core thing of a warcaster. You can be a bit of a hobby magpie with it. You can be like, well, that was fun. Let's get that command cadre, because I'm quite interested in how they play. Will I collect a full army of them? I may not. But because I've got them, they're quite fun for doing demos and to get other people into the game, because then they can go, I don't really like using the Khador. Have you got something else? It's like, I've got the Brine Bloods. I'm not that fussed by them, but you might like funny pirate trollkin. And they're like, yes, please, I'll have more of that. So I've been finding that as a good hobby magpie thing. And I think Age of Sigmar, I felt at one point, allowed you to do a little bit of that, because I think you were able to have certain allied units, I think, at one point.
So in the main game now, there are regiments of renown, and what they've done is they've changed from like a general allies thing to this is a specific set of guys as mercenaries. You get this regiment of these guys, and they've got some extra special rules on top of the usual stuff. And that I think that's generally a good idea. I think some of them have sort of ended up being a bit dominant in terms of choices there. And one thing I'd actually like is I'd like to see some smaller options there, because, for example, I've got Skaven. They're in the whole Chaos Grand Alliance. The new Blades of Khorne hero they previewed, the new Deathbringer, fantastic model. I kind of like an excuse to get him, but a lot of the regiments are renowned tend to be like this guy and 2 units. And in a way, I'd like something even smaller than that. I could, this guy and a unit of 5 men, or this guy and a couple of heroes. I'd like that. But they sort of exist in that respect. So you can do some of that with the allies. A lot of the allies are locked to the general alliances, so you can't get Chaos Guy for your destruction. Except they did change that when they did over Christmas. They released some new ones, and they came up with some fun ones there. It feels like maybe they're starting to push at the boundaries and feeling a bit more comfortable with the system. So, for example, there was the ability to get a group of Nurglings as mercenaries for any army, because a unit in your army is sick with Nurgle's rot, and basically during the game, when they die, they explode and Nurglings pour out everywhere.
Yeah, that's great. Like, more of that, please.
Yeah. And then there was some other explanations. Like I think there's a Caradron group who are super. The Caradron are meant to be really mercenaries, so these are mercenaries. They'll work for almost anybody. There's a ghoul. There's a Flesh Eater Court regiment of renown, I think, who will work for Chaos, because I think they were Chaos before they got infected, and they still think they are.
There also, I think there's also a unit which is it like, I think it's a Nighthaunt unit, or it might be Soulblight, that you can use with Forces of Order, because of course not all undead.
It might be something I can't remember all of them, but some of that stuff is it's sort of starting to come through. The other thing they've done for the Hobby Magpie thing, I think they've done quite well, is with Spearhead, which is its own game mode. So what they've recognised is that a lot of these games don't actually scale down that well, and they kind of did it a bit with 40k, right, with the Combat Patrol. But with Spearhead, they went all guns blazing. They said its own battle mat, its own rules, its own objectives, special cards, special rules, so that you can get your box and play against any of these other boxes. And obviously the core rules are the same. You're still playing Age of Sigmar, the spites, but a lot of things have been changed to make it work better at that scale for fun, low stakes, smaller games. And so that element there, you can buy a Spearhead for any faction, and that might be it. That might be all you do for that faction. You go, I really want to paint Lizardmen or Seraphon. Because they look cool. I want to do some cool jungle colours, and you can buy the box and then you can play with it, and then you can be done, and you're not actually just halfway to the army project that you never actually got to play. You've completed the thing. Like, as you know, the advantage of so many skirmish games is the ability to just pick up a Necromunda gang or whatever and do that one thing and play. So Spearhead kind of goes there a bit. With a dozen Necromunda gangs. But Necromunda is the archetypal version, and there's a lot of games now have either come as skirmish games that are very similar in that respect, where they're like, buy the box of these 10 guys and a couple of extra things you bolt on, and there you go. And Spearhead is a kind of interesting way, and I think much more developed than Combat Patrol 40k, of making that. I don't know if it'll last or anything like that, but it feels like they've maybe gone, oh yeah, actually this is, you can't just be like, buy 500 points of guys and play with our full rule set for 500 points, it'll be fine, because it generally won't. But if you go, actually, we can just put some time and effort into making this interesting. It might not be super competitive or super well balanced, but if it's fun, then you can get people to go, oh yeah, I'll pick this up.
I think that's my one critique of Spearhead, is that compared to Warmachine, it's like, Warmachine at small scale Warmachine works at all scales, I think.
I mean, Warmachine, the dice mechanic, this has changed rapidly. It doesn't work that well at very large scales, because the 2d6 you can't mass roll. But certainly,
no, true. But then also they've reduced the number of, as we said at the beginning of this, you don't have tar pit units anymore. So it's kind of like they recognise that. It's interesting how different companies attack all these kind of like, or even within Games Workshop, how they attack the challenge of people that are more time poor than ever, and competing against like computer games and RPGs and everything else. So yeah, like, I mean, I don't know like how much you've been asked, like, so what is like the like your transition to writing for Black Library, like how did that happen? Like,
so it kind of happened. You could see it as an outgrowth of how my writing for RPGs was kind of going, but obviously, yeah. So with role playing, I was doing a lot of role playing game writing. And I have done miniatures game writing in the past as well. When I worked for Mongoose Publishing.
okay.
Yeah, so I worked on some miniatures games there as elements of that. And but I haven't really touched anything like that. And then I came back and I didn't really touch role playing games as a job, sort of as work, for quite a lot of years after I left Mongoose Publishing. And I started working again for Onyx Path, as was on. My first work for them was for the Forsaken Second Edition, and obviously I worked for many years on that. And obviously, a lot of these games have got little fiction blurbs in them. The Onyx Path, those kind of ones, they love their little mini vignettes and little stories. And I remember getting tapped to write a short story for the Well for the Forsaken fiction anthology that came out. I put that in. And then you naturally kind of find yourself writing a little bit of fiction in these things because of the way that Onyx Path structures their role-playing games and presents them generally. So I was doing more of that, and I've written fiction and fiction-adjacent stuff separately as well. And I did another short story for them, and then I got asked to write a novella for Eon, and I was being asked by another company to write the fiction for their role-playing game Omega Horizon that's come out. I wrote a load of fiction for that book. And as part of that, Black Library do a yearly submissions open call.
Yeah.
Right. And I've got a bit of a bugbear about how people often talk about this. I want to say it's an open call. It's not a competition. But maybe I'll go into that later. Maybe it's an open call where they invite people who would like to write for them to submit writing samples, and they will give a specific thing. Like, we want writing samples related to Space Marines, or some people. In my case, it was the one that got me through was Dawnbringer Crusades in Age of Sigmar.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And there might be different levels of how tight that pitch needs to be. And then you'll put a sample in, and then they'll have a look at it, basically. Mm-hmm. And I understand why they do it this way as well, because if you just had a general, we're open to submissions all the time, for a company like Games Workshop with as many fans as Games Workshop, they would be buried in submissions all the time. So they do this every year. Obviously, there are.
I was going to say that allows them to do a bit of targeted gap filling with what they want to do with to get their fiction, because like odds are everyone wants to write about Space Marines, brilliant, but they've got other IP to develop.
Yes, yeah, and I've got a comment about that as well. I'll make that in a bit. Obviously, they still get writers they approach through other means. But because I wasn't really attending any of the kind of cons where they discuss things, and I didn't really have, and my writing was all in IP related tie-in fiction, but it was all role-playing game, relatively small end stuff. So I wasn't really on the radar of Black Library as a writer to get in touch with. Or if I want to write for them, which would be fun. I thought that'd be cool. And I applied. So I submitted twice, did it twice, 2 years in a row. And the second year I was successful. And the first year I did it, I remember that the topic was different then, but I put my thing in. I kind of read it and I thought, right. I was having a bit of a thing at the time, applying to different role-playing game companies to get more work, and trying to figure out how to deliver. Because it's always tricky with that. Send us some samples. What of my work is a good sample, especially for role-playing games, where often the whole interlaced shape of things is what matters, not just an individual bit of text. But and so I thought, I was in that kind of headspace at the time. I was quite frustrated with trying to get through the barriers that companies were putting up with, send us your writing samples. Okay, but that's all you're telling me. Can you give me any more information for what you're looking for? So what I tried to do was I tried to write something that I was, from what they've written, I was kind of going, this is what's going to appeal style-wise and such to them. So I kind of tried to very much craft a piece for my little submission.
Yeah.
That I thought maybe played some of my strengths, but it was very much about trying to see if I could get through the jump the hoops. And I didn't. I heard back a while back, we're not taking your submission further. Okay, fine. It was not that much work on my part to submit it, and I didn't have high expectations anyway. Saw it again next year, and I thought I'll try again. But this time it was Age of Sigmar, Dawnbringers. I was starting to get back more into Age of Sigmar at that time, really starting to enjoy elements of the setting. But I took a key and crucial difference to my submission this time, which was that I thought, screw it, I'm not going to write what I think they want. I'm going to write what I want. Because frankly, if they hired me to be a writer based off something that's purely crafted to try and suit what I think their needs are, and that's not me as a writer, well, then we're both in trouble when I get hired, because that's not how I write. That's not who I am. Yeah. So they're not going to get what they want, or I'm not going to get what I want. So I just flung myself I just wrote a very self-indulgent is the wrong word, but I took my writing style. I went all in, and I got a response back going, well, it's a little bit overwrought, but we'd like to see more. And that started it, and that got me through those sort of hoops and into the overhaul, and then eventually to writing for them all the way up to now, which I can say I'm working on a novel for Age of Sigmar. That's about all I can say. Yeah. So I've had 3 short stories published and now working on a novel, and that was one of the things for me. There was really about just writing something that was for me rather than for them, because I thought that was how really I needed to think about it in that way. I need to think about what was best for me, because it's all very well going, I really want to work for Games Workshop, Black Library, but you also got to think about you want to do it in a way that's going to be fun. What you really want, not something else. Another thing that did cross my mind as a note about writing, you said about finding writers of different IPs. I had seen in an interview with a different writer that they were like, there's a lot of writers for 40k stuff. There's not so many for Age of Sigmar. I thought, well, I'll go for the Age of Sigmar one then for sure, because because in a very calculating way, I'm probably going to have a bit less competition. So that's how that sort of started off. Now, and obviously my interest in Age of Sigmar and GW in general is not like just popped out of nowhere. I've been playing their games since I was a wee lad. I had a big gap sort of after university for I guess about a decade where I didn't really follow Warhammer very much.
Same.
But then I've sort of come back to it in dribs and drabs more and more over time. And so it's always been something that it's always underpinned, because I've read so many codexes and Warhammer armies books and even some fiction in the games. It's as a kid, it shaped a lot of my thinking about game mechanics and delivery of fiction and narrative and game elements in games going on. It's very formative, I think, for a lot of people, especially British people in the industry, because for a lot of us, it's a major part of what we grew up with. So then to come around at the end of it and actually be writing for that is pretty great. It's also a big challenge. You've got to work within the limitations of what you're given, but also you want to make something good. That's the real thing I struggle with is, because you could write crap and
you could the day and age that we're in now, it's so the day and age now is you could slop is made so easily by everyone because of AI, but also there was a time and period where slop was made by writers just generally filling Amazon with
and no shade on people who are writing good pulpy action, and there's a lot of that in like in Black Library and stuff. There's fantastic work, and I'm not saying I'm trying to create great literature, but you want to create something, whether it's pulpy fiction or literature, whatever, that's going to be enjoyed by people, and they can think like, this is a cool part of the setting, a cool part of what makes, say, Age of Sigmar, and that's the real bits when you're staring at a thing and you're like, how do I make this resonate? How do I make this interesting? How do I make this Warhammer rather than just something
generic fantasy? I mean, that's something I always come back to with like why, and I think you appreciate that because we did the Iron Kingdoms 2E streams, and I guess you would appreciate it for when I do get my ass into gear and run one for Iron Kingdoms Requiem is like D&D doesn't interest me because I find most D&D settings are so there's something very stale about them, and also very, I want to use the word turgid, like there's a lot of nothing, if that kind of makes sense. Like,
there's a lot of assumptions that then aren't supported on there. They don't fill the interesting gaps in those assumptions.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I'm actually running a 2024 fifth ed campaign at the moment. And because there were some people here in Wrocław who were like, they're post, maybe we could try doing some role playing in English to practice our English. And
Sure.
I was like, I'll run it. And when I said at the creation, I said, we could run it in a standard setting. And also at some point I might like to transition to like a Planescape game because I love Planescape.
Yeah.
Or I could just make my own setting. And they were like, yeah, we trust you to have a crack at that. And what I did was I looked at a bunch of the assumptions and said, what if we build out from those? So in the core book, there's 4 cleric subclasses, domains.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's 4 gods.
Yeah.
For each one of those. And then things like, if we take all these elements about this magic and stuff, and I go, well, and we have ancient empires, okay, so we now have modern empires who have been using magic. So there are people with thermonuclear weapons out there. You know, there's world powers who have gone, if we get a lot of very powerful wizards in one place, we can do some pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Let's do that. You know, and it's been an incredibly fun campaign so far because the players have bought in to me being able to do some sort of around, it's mostly still around the fringes, but some more out there stuff. I would say that while 5e24, it's got all the flaws and foibles of 5th ed that you know and don't love. You know how it is with a good group can make most systems good.
Yeah.
You know, and that certainly carries it, but also just a willingness to kind of like look at some of the spaces that 5th ed just D&D generally isn't interested in touching, and just goes, oh, it just works like that, and going, okay, but why?
Yeah.
Which, as you say, one of the things with the Iron Kingdom stuff, obviously built off D20 originally conceptually with the setting, is that it does do a lot of things where it goes like, well, actually, we've got an industrialized military situation. Yes, we have a bunch of D&D wizards running around. Okay, but what does that look like for a World War machine? Like, what happens at that point? So we have necromechanic. We've got the undead faction using machinery and undead and fusing it all together. So there's that interesting thing of like settings that take some of those assumptions and then actually run with them and do something with them and fill those gaps. One of the reasons I like Age of Sigmar, although a lot of it is unsketched out, it's got a lot of things where they go, let's just turn the dial up to 11 and do something wacky, you know. So that with, for instance, the Aqua Guaranis, the healing potions as money thing, the city where one of the money forms is distilled chunks of prophecy, and just weird stuff. And then they kind of play with it, and from a writing point of view, you can then play with that. One of, I think, my favourite short story I've written so far is called Hounds. It's set in the realm of beasts. And what I did was I sat down and I went, okay, this story is set in like a frontier town-esque situation out in the realm of beasts. Okay, that could easily be any kind of slightly grim, dark fantasy thing. Okay, but how do I make this reflect the setting? How do I make it reflect the realm of beasts? And I just sat there and tried to thread this through. And the metaphysics of Age of Sigmar let you really play with that in a way that can be you can turn the dial up quite a lot in how, and then going like, okay, but how does the local culture respond to this? How have people adapted to this, etc.? And you can just slot something like that in that's on the surface seems quite normal, but then you start to peel away and you find all the weirdness. You slot it in to Age of Sigmar, it just fits. It just goes. It's fine. And one of the most gratifying things was seeing people talking about it online going, I really liked, it was the first time I was really interested in the realm of beasts when I read this short story.
Oh, that's good.
The one that really, that kind of thing for me is like the details of where the rubber hits the road, where the metaphysics hits the lived experience of the people in it.
I think the closest I've had that, because like I'm kind of like, I think I'm getting to the point where I'd like to try and write some fiction for a game world at some point, but I think I'm going to start bugging Steamforged to do it for Iron Kingdoms, because like I'm deep in there, deep in with that setting these days, and I think there's a lot of gaps in the world and space to play about with. But related to it, like one of the things I really enjoyed, and I've said this a few times, like with Wrath and Glory, which gets really close to narrative for like fiction writing, was so in the Shards of Ulkari scenario, it assumes you're all playing Eldari.
Yeah, which is pretty unusual for most games.
Like we don't get often scenarios like that, and I'm hoping, like, if you're listening to me, Cubicle 7, let me write more of these awful space elves. But my pitch was like the opening scene was like, well, how do we get like the idea is like likely the players are going to be Corsairs, but there's nothing stopping them being a mixed party of an Azurani and a Corsair and a Drakari and heck, even a Harlequin and their
your standard role-playing game party of like people from wildly different walks of life,
and their pet human who's like some like rogue trader scion who's been like, well, I'm with these guys and I make tons of booty off it, and sometimes they pay me a lot because they have to go talk to humans and they need me to do that for them, which is in that scenario that can, if you play in the party with a pet human, is considered like high brow for the game. But one of the things which got close was because I had to like set the scene for the Corsairs meeting their patron for their mission, who is this Corsair prince. And I was like, well, how do we... And my pitch for it was like, it's a game of vampire. You're going to court with people who are the most bitchy people ever, who have emotions that can run so wild. And so you've got this court scene with Drakari and Corsairs and there's an Eldari warlock there with an entourage and everything. And it's all just set up to be like a standard game of vampire, basically. Like, people will be insulting you. People will be interested in where you're from. People will be wheeling and dealing and trying to go like, if you make this deal with them, but you're going to sell it to us on the side, aren't you? You are. And I feels the closest I've got to like 40k kind of like fiction writing, I guess, with that kind of world building.
The trick, one of the big tricks with one of the challenges with writing is world building. Ironically, is that it can get in the way. You need to, because you need to be kind of, the thing in the back of your mind is always like, how does this scene sit? How does this scene flow? How does this scene breathe? Is the pacing there? Is the drama there? Is the character there? I love world building, so my natural habit is just to start filling stuff with details to the point where I kind of have to drag myself off it. One of my editors said to me off the back of one, we're talking about a project, and off the back of a short story done, she said, I feel like you're a really character focused writer. I'm like, no, I'm terrible at characters. That's why I spend so much time focusing on that, is because I know it's one of my weaknesses. I would just be world building if you let me, and spend the whole time talking about details of the setting and adding new layers. But obviously you can't do that. You won't get a piece of fiction at the end of it. You'll get a treatise on trade of whatever it is in the lesser section of the...
We can't all be talking about fields and trees.
Exactly. There is time to talk about fields. There are times and places for that. And especially in a book where you are writing to a word count. Because obviously what I haven't done is I haven't written my own novel-length work that I've had published, etc., etc. So I haven't had the experience of just like, I'm going to write a book. I can write it to whatever length I want. What I have experienced in role-playing games, war games, and fiction is always writing to limits, and those often include word count. And for me, that's one of the really hard bits, is the knowledge in the back of my mind that I've got to fit all this stuff in to a set word count. And there's always that sense, that sort of Damocles of like, okay, I've got this wonderful idea for a story, but can I actually fit it in to what I've got here?
I don't know if, do you sometimes ever get the case where you go like, what your word count is, and you're trying to be informative? This could be the same for game writing, actually. You're trying to be informative, precise, concise, and then you realize like adding more words to, like, you're actually under your word count because you've done it nice and efficiently, and if you actually wrote any more, it's just superfluous crap. And you're like,
it can happen. I usually find in that circumstance I can think of something to dig into for more detail, to fill it. I have had times where I've gone like, I'm drowning in this word count. There's too much of it. I've got to fill it. I've got to come up with something to fill it. But what happened for me with making things, what my sort of critical moment, I guess, was so when I first started working on RPGs again, was for the second edition. I was working with Stu Wilson was the developer, and he was like, we need lean concise text. It's got to feel like Welf. It's got to feel focused. He was really pushing me on that in a good way. And his red lines from my work were really good, again, about getting... it was easy to do what he wanted because he was very clear about what he wanted. And then his red lines and his feedback were clear and toning it. But the specific thing I remember was I was writing what was the gifts section of Welf, the second edition, which was the supernatural powers that you could bolt on your Welf. And I remember thinking, I went back and I checked. What I did was I checked the gifts, because I was writing this stuff. And I was saying, I have to be really lean and focused here, not just because that's what we're supposed to do, but because I don't have a lot of word count for this. I was going back to the first edition gift to see which bits I was going to keep and which bits I was going to drop. And I found these things are massive. They've got reams and reams of text in first edition. So I checked the word count in the PDF. And this was, as I said, a bit of trial by fire. The gifts section in Wealth of the Forsaken first edition was twice the length of the word count I had to do gifts in second edition. So that made me buckle down and learn how to write focused, concise ways. And that stuck with me through RPG writing. I have no problems whatsoever being focused and concise. Like you say, occasionally you get problems where you feel like you're drowning in your word count. Like, how do I fill this? But I never have a problem in general getting...
I think when I say drowning word count, I think the cases I've had that is also where you're dealing with a licensed IP, is where you've been told convert this thing over to this game line, and you're like, okay, and you go like, you've got 500 words to describe that, to fill this out, and you're like, but the descriptions and information from like the codex or the army book or whatever doesn't even fill 200 words. Like, what am I meant to do? Like, there is no, and the point is like, it's very academic then, because of course you want to refer to the more recent books, because then the only way you're going to think like, well, where do I get more details from? You then start looking at like, well, can I go to third edition? Can I go to second edition and pull nuggets of cool story out to fill this character description? That's where I've had that drowning in word count, is really because codexes now are also really lean. Like, I find shockingly lean in places. It's very different to second edition 40k.
What I've found with fiction writing, at least, there isn't an issue with that, because that specific thing, because generally you can just make stuff up. Obviously within some limits, reason, but if you want to, like, if you're doing something you're saying, and you're like, what kind of character details can I add? What am I allowed to do? Obviously, you're writing a story. You go, I'm just going to make some stuff up about local beverages. Obviously, it needs to fit in the setting and things, but and it will get checked by your editor. And if you've written something completely outre, they'll be like, could you not do that, please? But generally, a lot of this stuff is reasonably easy to iterate on, because you have a bit more freedom and a bit more permission to come up with these kind of details in the first place. Often because simply no one's come up with that stuff ever in the past. So you're like, okay, here's something I can play around in. So in that respect, at least, that isn't an issue in fiction writing, thankfully. But I do find fiction writing is, it's just a very different experience from role RPG. Even world building writing for role playing games is just wildly different to fiction writing in terms of how easy it is to fill, or difficult it is to fill word counts, the pacing, everything is. It's a real. It's been a real trial by fire is the wrong word, but it's been a real test of my abilities moving into fiction writing. Shorter pieces have the closest crossover with RPG writing, because for various reasons. The longer it gets, the less crossover there is, and the more that you are learning or finding your way into a different skill set. I've been doing some more just a role-playing game writing on a different project recently, and it was really odd going back from writing a novel to just going in and being like, I've got 7,500 words on this to write, and being, oh wow, I've just written a quarter of it, like almost without thinking. It's that easy. And obviously a lot of role-playing game writing, what comes to templates, it comes to structures, things that kind of help you fill that out anyway. Whereas with a book, it's you and a book, and you've got to get your way through the book. There's no, with a role-playing game, you can chop things. You go, well, here's the powers section, here's the bits where I write up some archetypes.
Because I am interested in trying to maybe dabble with more fiction writing, mainly kind of looking towards Iron Kingdoms. Actually, it's like, I'm hoping Steamforge will be like, yes, we want to start putting more fiction out, and they do put fiction out within the app to support, like, basically for the army books within the
Mm-hmm.
app. But like, how do you? I guess the question is how much. How do you? I guess how do you organize your fiction writing? Do you have a process?
Yes. So, and again, this is gonna with different clients. There will be
Yes.
different processes. I've had so I would say games at Black Library have current at least now. I've heard different things maybe from some writers in the past, but now my experience has been very good with the processes. In terms of getting a lot of support generally with like talking through pitching, outlining, so on and so forth. Some places I've been like, hey, do you want to write a thing? Write this. Okay, here's my idea. Yeah, sounds cool. Go write it. And you're like, okay. I hope this is going to work because I'm going to come back to you with 40,000 words of text later. And if you suddenly decide you didn't like one of the underlying ideas here, then we're going to be a bit up the creek. Whereas, Black Library's been generally very methodical about it. So I think the first thing is always going to be what does the client want and how well are they communicating what they want? Because that's the premise you've got to work to. And that's the risk as well, as if they don't communicate what they want very well. But so let's say the client said, "Oh, we want a story to go in this, and it's going to be X many words, and we want it to be maybe about this or whatever." Or please, they might say, "Pitch us some ideas about what it should be," and you have some back and forth. And the idea that I end up with might not be very similar to what starts out at that point. The kind of things, the suggestions get back and forth, they will get refined over time, ideally through conversation. Rather than just sort of emerging brilliantly like sparkling diamonds from the sea of my mind. These things have to be formed. You have to put ideas together. What I usually do is I have notes, a little sort of notes to myself. Usually I have some like an email chain to myself, so that when I'm like out and about, if I've got an idea, I won't do something sensible like put it in a notepad on my phone. I'll be like, send myself an email with the idea I've just had. And what I found is structures and processes that work for short stories don't always work for long ones. But the processes generally involve putting together a pitch with the very top level idea, then refining it into an outline, which would be the much more cohesive idea of what's actually happening, with more ideas of who the characters are, what's going on, and then. For a shorter fiction work, I'll then go away and write it. But what I will do is I will iterate it a lot, and I'll try different things depending on how the story feels. So I will rewrite a lot, and the same is true of my RPG work. Is my first draft is not my first draft; it's more like my fourth draft. I tend to rewrite quite a lot, and that might involve things like just rewriting paragraphs until the flow is right, or rewriting whole story sections, and go back and forth. And sometimes, so for example, my first short story. For GW, the first scene was based on my first writing sample, and then after the first writing sample, they said, "Could you please give us a writing sample with more dialogue, so we can see?" Because the first one didn't have much dialogue. So, "Could you give us a dialogue?" It's like that. And so I thought, I'll write the last scene of this potential story I had in my head. So when I started writing, I had the first scene and the last scene done, and I tried writing then front to back the rest of the story. And I couldn't make it work. I just couldn't get it to work for various reasons, including in the word count. And I thought, hold on. I scrapped it, kept the first scene, kept the last scene, and I wrote backwards from the last scene to the first scene. And suddenly it worked. It just worked. So there's little things like that you sort of try, different techniques for different sort of lengths of story. Sometimes stories are real sods, and I have to rewrite them until suddenly they click. Sometimes it's really easy, and almost the first draft is almost the first draft, but there's that element of like hammering away at the text, massaging, trying to work with it, learn from it, going back and forth. And then obviously ideally talking to your client and going like, I've got this idea. Does this work? Before you kind of deliver it to them, so that don't get wildly surprised when you've introduced some concept. There've been a few times when I've been given like a permission to like just surprise them for a client, and I've just gone with it, and thankfully it's kind of worked. I've had a good finger on the pulse of what the client wants, enough that I can actually wing it with just adding new ideas in or cool stuff that they then in one case went back and added into the main core of the game, because they're like, oh, that's a really cool idea for a thing, we'll put that in the game properly. That wasn't for Black Library, that was something completely different. But then there's and then obviously you have the back and forth process of like, it goes to editors, they check it, they send back with their changes, it goes back. And the key thing there is obviously not being precious about what you've written. Again, you're playing someone else's pool, you have to be aware they could want anything from that gone or changed. So you have to go into it being, okay, I cannot be too, touchy about any of this because it's not my thing, Longer work is something I'm still learning about the processes of. I mean, I've been helped and given direction from Games Workshop, but at the end of the day, you've kind of got to do it to learn how to do it. And for example, when you're writing a novel, you can't just stop and rewrite the whole thing.
No.
5 times. You just can't do it. You can do that with a short story if you're upset with it. You can't do it with a novel. And for that, I took many more notes. And I kept a bunch of spreadsheets as well, where I was putting notes out and character and plot. And I've decided that is the wrong way to write a novel. Because I found, especially later on in the process, it was getting in the way more than it was helping. They talk about people who wing it and then people who plan. And I think I'm somewhere kind of in the middle. And I definitely found what too much planning was for me. There was that thing where I just had too much of this stuff written and I just couldn't process it all when I was doing the writing itself. There were too many things to keep, I was trying to juggle rather than just letting the writing itself take me forwards. I was too in my mind rather than in the writing. That's not really a problem for short stories because they're so short. You're never really ending up with so much information to juggle. Yeah. But for longer work, you get increasing numbers of these things you need to think about how to approach. And I think that's something that probably is going to be varying from writer to writer, and it's always going to be very personal because there are some people who will plan, who do like a snowflake method. They do the top and then they plan the next stage down, they plan the next stage down, and they do it all the way down until you've literally got the sentences on the page. And the whole thing is meticulously planned. And you've got the people who sit up one day, blank page, start typing, and I can do that for short stories, but longer things get too unwieldy.
I don't know where I would fit into that if I ever had a hand to do anything that long, because from developing the Trash Humanism quick start recently, my approach to it was, obviously I've got writers who've never written for a game before, so I took the software engineering approach to writing some game text, which was literally, this scene must do this, this scene must do this, this scene must achieve this. And I just stubbed it out as a minimum viable product almost. And I wrote the most generic cyberpunk scenario possible. And then the development process was, as the writing came in and they attacked each scene, it evolved away from that and it gained more character. But because I'd done the structuring and set the questions and expectations of, we enter here and we must exit here, it helped focus the writing. And I don't know whether that would be appropriate for writing long fiction. I mean, it may do, because obviously I know you could well think in terms of scenes, and stuff has to occur in a scene. So, but would that work? I don't know.
I think, and it's also going to depend on the particular story as well, and all those kind of things. There's a lot of context that you can talk about generally, but when you come to the specific, it could change radically. Yeah.
Especially because linearity of storytelling, you may not be telling the story in a straight linear way, whereas like RPGs are more or less linear.
Yeah, but even then, I mean, the nature of an RPG, like I tend to prefer to write, I don't like to write scenarios that are chains of events. I prefer to write situations where, for example, here are the players, here's what they want, here's why they can't have what they want, or here's what's going to happen. Here are the players, now your players are in there, light the fuse, run away, see what explosion happens. And the thing I love about RPGs is that when you put it into play, stuff happens that no one really has control over. Yeah. Things go in directions you didn't foresee. And my favorite thing is always like seeing what happens with that, letting players push at something, not in a kind of never say no. Sometimes saying no is important for setting the structure of making things work and giving people the framework for them to work, but letting them explore, push, and see and do stuff that you didn't foresee without shutting up again. Well, that's not what that's not allowed. But going, let's see where this takes us. And the problem with writing is you can't do that because it's all on you. Yeah. You can't be like, there's 5 of us, we're going to come up with some cool collaboratives to see what bubbles up. It's all on you, and you've got to do all of it. And that almost brings it in to be, I suppose, the experience quite linear, because you as the writer, you are writing one sentence after another. You're building on what you've done. Even if the story isn't linear, your process through it might well be.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it needs to be, for most literary works, there needs to be an A to B thread going through. Like the person starts on page 1, they read through, and even if the story's not linear, they finish on. Obviously, some writers play with that and do crazy stuff with books that aren't linear experiences in that respect, but that's always going to be a rare chunk of writers doing that, not the mainstream, I suppose. So I think it's quite tough. I think it's going to be different challenges for different people, and you've got to you've got to get what support you can, and then learn yourself the hard way what does and doesn't work. I would say the best way to learn how to not write a novel is to write a novel, because you will learn all sorts of things that don't work along the way, repeatedly, and but then you will know, and the only way to know what does and doesn't work for you is to do it. Like for me, if I say, well, I found doing this stuff with the spreadsheet was too much, there'll be other writers for whom it is perfect, and that's how they do it. But now I know that for me, it has its flaws. Not fatally flawed. There's useful elements to how I was organizing my information, but that's something that would need to change in future. So the process is still something really I'm feeling my way through and learning stuff about. And I imagine it's probably true for a lot of writers, even who are much more successful and accomplished than I am, that they're still learning things as they go along.
So what's on your hobby horizon? Like, what's the big things for the rest of the year?
So obviously I've got for Black Library, I've got the further work on the novel I'm working on. Then from my own personal gaming, I've got some role-playing game work I'm doing for Eric Zavadsky, the developer the guy who developed Deviant, and is doing some more Deviant-related products on Storyteller's Vault. I'm doing something for him. And then currently, and then sort of the personally gaming side, I've got Age of Sigmar. I've taken my fully painted Skaven army to its first fully painted battle tomorrow. Very excited about that.
Tough pictures.
I've got. I'm going to the new edition of Warmachine. I'm going to play a demo game of that in a couple of weeks of arranged play. I'm quite excited to see. I'm going to dig out some of my old models and take them along as well, see if they're usable. But I'm excited to get back to try that out again. I'm running this D&D 5th Ed game. I'm hopefully at some point going to get back to a Age of Sigmar Soulbound game I was running. We'll see if that happens.
Soulbound's really good.
It is,
as a system, it's great.
It's a very specific kind of story you tell with it. But it does do that.
Does it really
the system supports that kind of action. I've seen there's like grim and perilous variants you can do with it, but I don't. For me, that's not really what I want. I'd rather use a different.
There's a context for that, and it's the Orphan Khan setting.
If I want to do grim and gritty Age of Sigmar, I'd rather use one of the other rule sets, not Soulbound hacked into that. But for what it is, it's very good. And maybe trying to find one or two more role-playing game campaigns to start or participate in, just to sort of flesh out my thing, because that my D&D game is like once every 2 weeks, and Soulbound currently is on hiatus anyway. So something to help build the calendar, give me a bit more going on, and maybe cast my eye around. Every time I go into so the nearest wargaming store here in Wrocław, where I live now in Poland, I spend most of my time in Wrocław anyway, is called Bolter and Bolter Cafe, and it's very well stocked with lots of different games. And every time I go in, I look at all these shelves of all these different games you see, like Warcrow and Conquest, and last time, and the more historical games, and the ones that kind of straddle the divide, and there's everything from big games to skirmish games. And I always look and I think, there's all this stuff that's cool, but I don't, so I'm thinking maybe looking into another game as well to start toying around with, out of this great selection that is there that I just don't interact with. It feels a bit of a shame. Obviously, it's not like you can't just pick up every game you want. It costs money. We're not all made of money, so you have to kind of pick and choose, and it's not always viable to just go, I'm just going to expand my hobby, because there's those considerations of money and time and everything else. But I feel like I've maybe got it in me to at least dabble in something new, maybe something small and light and easy to pick up, or at least low commitment in terms of buy-in. But I'm actually quite excited about this year because, especially like the past 6 months, I just have my head in the Word document, just writing. And last year, so I had some quite bad health issues for a couple of years. And those are, fingers crossed, mostly out of the way. So I'm looking at the latter half of this year going, I feel like I've got time, I've got the resources, and I've got more motivation for the first time in a while to really get back into like spreading my wings in gaming and the hobbies. So I'm really excited about this year, actually, just in terms of I haven't even paid attention to like new stuff that's coming out. Just the fact that I can do stuff is really really
it's
good.
There's a lot of cool stuff. Like, I mean, I've still got games I still need to actually play. Like, I've got miniatures for Batman miniatures game for the 3rd edition of that. I've still not played it. I've had miniatures for like going on 4 years now.
Wow.
Which is terrible of me. But I've been repainting my Scorn army, and I'm about maybe 40% of the way there. Looking around at where the miniatures are. Yeah, I'm about 40% of the way there. Though that might move on to the back burner with Old Umbre when that turns up, because I will race to get some of that painted for PeachCon in August. So Chris Peach has his little convention in Derby, so I'm going along to that, running some Warmachine demos. And then I've got some Space Marine Scouts that I need to finish putting together for Kill Team, so I can actually play some Kill Team. Because again, I've got plenty of Kill Teams. I need to learn a new edition. And the Scouts I'm going to paint up as the Absolvers chapter, because obviously I wrote for them. So that'll be fun. Because then I've got a miniature of an Absolver Scout, which will fit the starter box of Wrath and Glory. So I'm kind of thinking like, then I've got a miniature for every model in the starter set. And then otherwise, like I said, I want to do Necromunda. I've finished a campaign. I finished running a Necromunda campaign. We did a siege.
Unheard of.
We finished it up with a 4-player siege where one gang, which was the top gang of the campaign, had a fort, and we were raiding it, and it didn't go well. It really did not go well for us. So that was good just to finish off narratively. Yeah. So now I'm going to do an audit of my Necromunda terrain to work out what I've got, reorganize it, and then be like, right, I don't need all of this Zone Mortalis shite. I just need my desert terrain, because we're going to do Ash Wastes like September time. And I put a poll up on Instagram, and I don't know how many people voted on it, but the top vote is I do a Van Saar gang for Ash Wastes, and I have plenty of Van Saar models. I have about 20 Van Saar, plus the Van Saar from Hive Secundus, the Hive Secundus box with the Malstrain Gene Stealer. And I've got vehicles for them, and I've got the hoverboards. So I'm going to do some weird-ass Van Saar on hoverboards, Ash Wastes, kind of like Desert Raider gang. So that's going to be hilarious fun. And then hoping that if I get enough people at the local club into Warmachine, there's about 3 of us so far, maybe 4, we'll get a Journeyman League going. And I'm running demos, and we're going to do a raffle so that someone can win a starter set. So
very nice.
It's all good. A lot of good hobby.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of cool terrain. Made some terrain. I've got, and then obviously I'm going to try and get through my backlog to make a gap so I can do some Trench Crusade. So yeah. And of course, at some point I'm going to be paid money to write for this fucking RPG. I mean that in the best sense of the word. But I'm going to have to then be like, do I paint toy soldiers, or do I write and write and write and write? So that's going to be the main thing. So yeah. Oh, and RPG wise, I picked up Eat the Reich, which is
yes,
I need to run because it's a very pretty book, but also has a good system in it. So I want to run that because I have ideas based upon that as well. But that's basically it. So do you have a website or social media that's where people can
I don't have a website. I probably should at some point. I actually, a year or two ago, I did take some steps towards trying to get that to happen, but other stuff happened. And I think it was about the time I ended up in hospital that I kind of got distracted. So,
is there a link? Is there the best link to find all your work on, say, Black Library or so forth?
Well, I mean, if you, I don't know. I'd have to look at the Black Library website. I suspect if you search for like Christopher Allen, my stuff will come up.
I've tried that, right? I've tried that. You'll find this hilarious. I put in your name, and oh no, I get it. If you put in so this is what you do. You have to put in Christopher Allen. You find all your work. If you put in Chris Allen, you find work that is in I think is in German.
Yeah, so not only is there, because a lot of my stuff for RPGs is as Chris Allen rather than Christopher Allen, but also there's at least one, maybe two other Christopher Allens who have in the past written stuff, including some things for Games Workshop. So there's some very odd things that ping up from like quite a long time ago that aren't me. It's one of those things, like I share a name with the previous owner of RPG Net as well.
Right.
Yeah, and he probably did a bunch of stuff. There's all sorts of odd stuff. Probably the easiest place to find me is I say easiest because you might rethink it when I say it. So I'm on Blue Sky.
Yeah.
I mean, technically I'm on Twitter, but all I seem to get on Twitter is constant spam messages. People going, "We're inviting you and 70,000 other people to talk about how our new crypto deal." And I was like, that's just terrible spam. I'm on Blue Sky. I am at acrozatarim. The rest is all the Blue Sky stuff. And acrozatarim is it's spelled how it sounds. Unfortunately, that doesn't make it any easier. But also if you search for, I think my name is like Christopher Allen on Blue Sky as well. So if you search for that, you might find me.
I'll include all the right links. I'll also include the link to your stuff that gathers all the stuff up on. I'll just make sure that's the right one. Yeah, there we go. That gathers all the stuff up on DriveThruRPG.
Some of the stuff, because I think some of the stuff on DriveThruRPG is Christopher Allen, some is Chris, and some of it I've worked on just doesn't seem to come up when you search because I've got a lot of stuff on there. It's very weird.
So yeah, and then obviously the link for the Black Library, your stuff there.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Because that'll collate it all quite neatly. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Cool. Thanks for taking time out to chat about stuff because we haven't spoken in freaking ages.
No, we haven't. We used to have not regular, but somewhat regular chats at cons in the UK.
Conventions, anyway. And I'm glad you've painted an army. That's really good.
Yeah.
Slay the grey, as they say.
Indeed.
That's really good. So yeah, looking forward to seeing pictures of your game and your army, and I hope you enjoy Warmachine because I'm bloody loving it right now.
I'm looking forward to it.
I'm trying to think of other interesting things I should be promoting. Obviously, look up Trash Humanism if you want to know about that RPG. Check out all the other episodes of Dark Days Radio. We will be putting out a deep dive into Cult shortly as a podcast and as video. I need to do some video editing, and I might have time for that tomorrow. The Cult backer kit is opening soon, so if you missed it you can back it, and I say back it because I wrote something for it. Obviously also out for pre-order, and if you pre-order it you will get the PDFs for it immediately. I say immediately with a caveat. The Old World RPG from Cubicle 7 is now out to pre-order. That is the RPG using a D10 dice pool system, so this is different to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It is its own system, but it's still grim, dark, and perilous, set in the Old World as of the Old World War game. So historically, it's set 200 years before current Warhammer, before the time of Magnus the Pious, the time of the Three Emperors, before Mordheim is turned into a car park. And again, I've written for that game, and the PDF you will get immediately is the player's guide. The PDF that is to come soon that you will get as part of your pre-order is if you order the whole whatever you pre-order, is the Games Master's guide. And yeah, so that's all there. And obviously once they've collated all the errata, then the printed versions will be done. I think they're looking at about end of the year, early next first quarter 2026 for shipping the core books out. So that's all I can think of on that front. I'm trying to think of the last time I recorded one of these episodes. Other things out: Shards of Ulkari. Buy that. It's a Eldari scenario we just talked about. Darktide Extraction is a Darktide scenario, whole campaign book for Wrath and Glory based upon Darktide. So it means it's Wrath and Glory, not set in the Gilead sector. Shock horror. And what else was there? Yeah. And also out, obviously, to it's gone to backers. I think the books are getting ready to be published out, and that means they'll soon be available to buy. Is Strange Light Workshop for Iron Kingdoms, which is ghost hunting in Iron Kingdoms using the 5e setting, which is, I would say, possibly the fun light way of playing D&D 5e, because you're generally not going to be killing much stuff and fighting much stuff. It's you versus like a ghost or two, and doing investigative, procedural investigations of crime and misdemeanors and history and law. So I'd like to run a stream of that, and so Chris, you might get pinged for that at some point.
That sounds like that'd be quite fun.
Yeah, so I think that's everything. If you want to find out more, go to www.darker-days.org. You can find us on social media. Don't bother with X because it's a pile of crap.
Oh yeah, it's cool. Sorry, I was saying Twitter. I got it wrong. Sorry.
I know, right? And you can find out more on my website, as always. But that is everything for Realm of Fire for now. So thank you for listening, and thank you again, Chris. And goodbye for now.
Goodbye.